Hi guys, welcome back. We're still carrying on the subject of radiography. Today we'll just be discussing digital imaging. Okay, so these slides again are on E2Do, okay? I think under learning unit number 22. So please just check under TAT 5000, learning unit 22. Download these so that you can just follow and pay attention. So these are some of the learning objectives you're expected to achieve that are basically self-explanatory, but essentially we expect you guys to know the advantages and disadvantages of digital radiography, the fundamental systems of digital radiography, and then some advantages and disadvantages of digital imaging systems. Okay, so those are essentially some of the things, as well as obviously terminology always being important with every learning unit. Okay, then from there we expect you guys just to briefly describe the rationale for scanning and clearing of phosphoplates that we'll touch on as the lecture goes on. So essentially, ladies and gentlemen, today you'll just be learning the advantages and disadvantages, as well as the basic concepts regarding digital radiography, scanning, as well as digitizing dental images. You'll basically get more clarity in terms of the types and the uses of intraoral and extraoral films, and then from there you will learn how to use conventional X-ray films, how to manually and automatically process these films, and then how to duplicate film. And then furthermore, most importantly would be then to recognize common errors that are done within the dental practice, and then what preventative measures you can implement to make sure that they do not occur again, or to correct whatever error that has taken place. Okay, so basically digital radiography has been used in dentistry since 1987. It's becoming more and more common in our dental practices in South Africa, which is a good thing because they save time, even though they're a bit more expensive. Okay, so when it comes to digital radiography, we prefer using the term dental image, as opposed to radiographs, x-rays, or films, because essentially when it comes to these systems, we prefer using image, or the word image, because it's a better term to describe the picture that is being produced instead of a radiograph or an x-ray film. Okay, so these images can be emailed to insurance companies or medical aids, in our instance in South Africa. But essentially, more importantly, they can also be digitized, enhanced, printed, stored, or even sent to other offices by email or even by post. But obviously in the age of technology, we'd then be using emails. Okay, if a patient requests hard copies, it's also easy for us to just print them by making use of the appropriate systems or software, so that the patient can actually get records wherever necessary. Then from there, a conventional X-ray machine, ladies and gentlemen, is still used when it comes to digital radiography. Okay, so this then essentially requires the positioning of the image receptor, which is our sensor or phosphor storage plate, into the patient's mouth, and is identical to positioning with film. So essentially what they're trying to say is how we would position our film, our X-ray films, is the same way we'd be positioning our image receptor or our sensor when it comes to digital radiography. So then from there, strict infection control measures must be used, because sensors and these phosphoplates are reused time and time again. So in a South African context, in the practices I've worked at, before and after use for every patient, you disinfect not only the receptor but even the cord as well. You'd want to place a clear or a transparent plastic on top of the sensor or the receptor, so that it's not prone to damage, and as well adhering to infection control protocols or measures. And then from there, placing it into the patient's mouth intraorally before we actually take a digital image. So that's essentially how we try to maintain strict infection control measures in terms of a South African context. But from here, they're just telling you that in America, the FDA, or they are FDA cleared disposable fluid impervious barriers that must be used on digital image sensors and phosphoplates at all times. But we essentially also have to adhere to strict infection control measures, like I mentioned, disinfecting the sensor and the cord before and after every patient, as well as making use of disposable transparent papers, if I can put it that way, to just protect our sensors and receptors from infection. From there, ladies and gentlemen, we have two basic types of methods that can be used to acquire a digital X-ray image. So the first one is by means of direct imaging, and then the second one would be by means of indirect imaging. So essentially with direct digital imaging, ladies and gentlemen, this is a system that includes the following components. So we have 1, an X-ray machine, 2, a sensor, 3, a computer monitor, 4, and most importantly, computer software. So with direct digital imaging, it essentially makes use of a solid-state sensor that contains an X-ray sensitive silicone chip with an electronic circuit. So these sensors normally are made out of CCDs or charged coupled devices. As your slide says, it is the most commonly used type of digital receptor. So essentially with CCDs, ladies and gentlemen, what those are, a CCD is a solid-state detector comprised of a grid of small transistor elements that convert X-rays to electrons. So the electrons produced by this X-ray are then deposited in a small box, or well known as a pixel. Okay, and then from there, this pixel that is then deposited is a digital equivalent of a silver halide crystal that is used in traditional radiology. I don't know if that makes sense to you guys. So the CCD is a solid detector, and it contains elements. So upon activating our X-ray, essentially what happens is that electrons are then produced by our X-ray, and then they are then deposited into what is then known as a pixel. So a pixel is comparable to our silver halide crystals that are found with conventional X-ray films. Okay, and then from there, that's how essentially we get our image at the end of the day. That is essentially how we get our image. So once these elements are exposed to the X-ray, they are read, and the electron charges that were activated by the X-ray are converted to form the digital image. So with direct digital imaging, we have a situation where the sensor is placed in the patient's mouth, and then the patient is then exposed to X-rays. The image is then produced on the surface of our sensor. It is then digitized and then transmitted to our computer, and then almost immediately we have an image that appears on our monitor. The software that is on our computer is then used to enhance the image and store the image as part of the patient's records. So that's essentially what takes place as part of direct digital imaging. So you place it in the patient's mouth, you place the sensor in the patient's mouth, you go outside, you activate the X-ray. The X-ray then essentially converts elements into electrons. Then the electrons are then placed into what is known as a pixel, and then that's essentially how we get our resultant image that is transmitted to our computer software that is able to detect, digitize, as well as store the image, which is then the final product that you end up seeing after you've taken your X-ray. So then with indirect digital image or imaging, we have a system that essentially consists of the following components. So we have 1, our image plates. 2, we have a dock container. 3, we have a scanner with a carousel computer. 4, most importantly, we have our computer software. And then lastly, we have a view box. Okay, so indirect digital imaging is also known as phosphor storage imaging. Okay, so essentially with this system, you have a situation in which the image receptor is a thin flexible plate, basically the size of a conventional film X-ray, and this flexible plate of ours is coated with phosphor crystals. So upon activation, remember, you'd have placed it into the patient's mouth. You go outside to go take your X-ray. The thin flexible plate then has phosphor crystals, like I mentioned, and then this layer, upon activation or exposure to the X-ray, is able to store the energy of the X-ray photons, for X amount of time. So then that's how the scanner now comes into place, because now the scanner is then required to read the information that was stored on the plate by making use of a laser beam to release the energy from the plate and convert it into a digital image. So what happens with phosphor storage imaging is that it has sensors that essentially are similar to film in the way they look and in the way they are processed. So with our phosphor storage imaging, we have technology that basically makes use of thin flexible plates, as we had seen and mentioned before, that are coated with a phosphor layer, which then when exposed to the X-rays, are stored in the X-ray image as a latent image. This is then similar to the way silver halide crystals within the film emulsion are stored as a latent image. Né? Then from there, the image plates are covered with a barrier and then placed in the mouth by making use of a film holding device. So as you guys are following, you may, or it may appear to you or click to you that this phosphor storage imaging is very similar to our conventional film technology that we've already learned about. Né? So these plates, like I mentioned before, are flexible and fit into the mouth much like our intraoral films. So unlike with the direct digital imaging sensors, there is no cable attached. Okay, so we just have our thin flexible plate. Né? So the image plates are then placed on a high-speed laser scanner that then releases the energy stored on the plates, converting the information into a digital image. Okay, so this is then similar to what your slide is essentially explaining, that the plates are scanned and then they are exposed to a bright light thereafter that erases all the remaining energy, and then the plates are then be ready to be used again. So for the sake of infection control, the imaging plates, which are our thin flexible plates, are inserted into specifically designed barrier envelopes, because with these plates, they can be reused over and over again. So we must be very strict with our infection control. And then from there, our barrier envelope is then sealed by removing the adhesive strip and then pressing the envelope closed. So that's essentially how we maintain infection control when it comes to phosphor storage imaging. So like I just mentioned before, guys, the imaging plate, which is our thin flexible plate, is positioned in the patient's mouth, obviously making sure that we have placed our barrier envelope as we had just discussed. And then from there, after being placed into the patient's mouth, we make use of the same positioning techniques as with conventional dental x-ray film. Okay, so we try to make sure or ensure that our imaging plate is parallel to the tooth that is of interest at that particular time. So after exposure, the imaging plate is then carefully removed from our barrier envelope and is then placed into the scanner that uses a laser to display the image onto our computer. So like I mentioned before, once the plate is exposed to the x-rays, it is placed into a dark container until all films have been taken. The image plates are then placed on a high-speed laser scanner to release the energy stored onto the plates, converting the information into a digital image. So then our computer makes use of digital values to reconstruct the image onto the computer. So laser scanning processing makes the PSP technology similar to our film-based technology, in that both our X-ray film that makes use of silver halide crystals and the image placed must essentially be developed at a later stage, or developed after being exposed to our X-ray. Okay. So now, because of this extra step, we may find a situation in which it takes seconds to minutes for this type of radiography to process and get to our computer system as we'd like. Okay, so as a result of this extra step, more time is consumed in chair by the patient as opposed to with direct digital imaging. So after the imaging plates have been scanned, they must be cleared between each use by exposing them to a very bright light like that of a view box, and then from there this is kept onto this view box for several minutes. So once the image is then erased from the image placed, they can be sterilized and then used again. So just like how your slide is explaining, the imaging plates cannot be autoclaved, ladies and gentlemen, and extreme care must be taken when handling them to avoid scratches or dust. So once you've placed them onto that bright light, leave them alone. Just monitor that all of the how can I say this? The scanner, all of the energy that has been stored onto the plate has been released and cleared, and then from there we can just gently remove them and make use of them again.